The sky had not been blue in years. It hung heavy, a bruised, unbroken grey, like a wound that refused to heal. Sunlight, once warm and reliable, had been replaced by a dim, cold glow, filtered through layers of dust and ash. It never reached the ground properly, never warmed the earth. Shadows lay flat and long, stretching over landscapes that no longer remembered life. The eclipse had come and stayed, a slow, silent suffocation pressing down on everything that remained. Cities, once vibrant, bustling centers of humanity, had become ghostly monuments to what we lost. Skyscrapers leaned like wounded giants, their steel frames twisted and rusted, glass windows blown out or blackened with soot. Streets were fractured and littered with remnants of hurried departures. Abandoned cars, broken bicycles, scattered possessions, and the occasional charred skeleton of a building that had tried to resist the inevitable decay. Parks were unrecognizable, overrun by weeds and thorns, the soft greenery replaced by brown, brittle remnants of once-living flora. Rivers that had carried life and trade now slithered as cracked ribbons of mud, their banks choked with debris and the skeletons of fallen bridges. The air itself had changed. It carried a permanent tang of iron and rot, a mixture of dust, smoke, and something older, something lingering from chemical spills, fires, and decaying infrastructure. Breathing it became a conscious effort, lungs struggling to filter the invisible threats that lurked in every inhalation. The wind carried whispers of the past, snatches of laughter, the cries of a city that once thrived, the silent roar of nature reclaiming its dominion. Nature had grown stranger and crueler. Fires had scorched forests, leaving blackened spires that clinked like dry bones in the wind. Once fertile plains had turned to cracked, sun-baked earth. In some areas, violent floods, born of rains that defied seasonal patterns, had washed away entire settlements, leaving nothing but mud and ruin. Hurricanes and tornadoes struck without warning, tearing open the fragile remnants of human shelter. Temperature swings were no longer predictable. Nights plunged into freezing darkness, while days could reach unbreathable heat, a constant assault on the body and mind. Civilization, as it had been known, was gone. Governments had dissolved under the weight of catastrophe, their offices abandoned, their powers meaningless. Military and police forces fractured or vanished entirely, leaving survivors to navigate the ruins on their own. Some groups banded together in fragile communities, scavenging what remained and defending themselves with makeshift weapons. Others roamed alone, hardened and dangerous, scavengers and raiders who preyed on those weaker or slower. Law was a memory, trust, a scarce commodity, rationed more carefully than water. Institutions that once organized society, the markets, schools, hospitals, now existed only as husks. Shelves were empty, walls crumbled, and the knowledge of how to rebuild was locked away in fading memories or buried in books too fragile to survive the new reality. Some survivors clung to technology, salvaging solar panels, radios, or batteries, but most of it was unreliable, like trying to capture sunlight in a storm. The old ways of life had failed spectacularly. What remained was improvisation, endurance, and the constant search for sustenance. Amid all this, small signs of life persisted. Scavenger camps huddled in ruined subway tunnels or crumbling warehouses. Fires burned in defiance of the cold, smoke curling like fragile prayers into the unchanging sky. Birds adapted, scavenging near human settlements, while animals long thought domesticated became feral, surviving by cunning and force. These glimpses reminded anyone paying attention that life would not be fully extinguished, even under the weight of endless shadow. Walking through the ruins, it was impossible to ignore the pervasive anxiety. Every turn of a street could reveal danger, a collapsed building, a hostile survivor, or a sudden environmental hazard. The horizon offered no comfort, only the same grey smear punctuated by jagged silhouettes of what had been. And yet, amid the despair, there was a strange, stubborn pulse. The knowledge that somewhere, someone was still moving, still breathing, still resisting the silence. This was the world now, broken, dangerous, and unrelenting. But it was ours to navigate. Every ruined city, every scorched field, every hollow riverbed was a challenge, and every day survived, a quiet triumph. The endless eclipse had taken everything familiar, but not yet the spark of human will. And so, life crawled forward, step by cautious step, through dust, shadow, and ash. I am the voice in the static. You might hear me over a crackle of interference, a low hum of electricity, or the faint whine of a generator that threatens to fail at any moment. My name is unimportant. What matters is that I am still here, that I survived when so many others did not. I am one of the few who moves through the endless eclipse with eyes open, lungs full of the dusty, acrid air, heart still stubbornly beating. Before all of this, I had a life, a simple, ordinary life, with routines, comfort, and people I loved. I had a home, warm and familiar. I had family. I had friends. I had a world that made sense. And then the skies darkened, the rivers dried, the storms came, and everything fell apart. I lost them all. First, the city I lived in succumbed to fires that raced faster than anyone could escape. Then, the hospitals filled, then emptied. The streets emptied, until I was alone except for the occasional scavenger, a fleeting shadow in the ruins. Their voices, their faces, their laughter, gone. Sometimes I swear I still hear echoes in the wind, but when I follow them, I find nothing but broken concrete and rusted steel. Survival is no longer a choice. It is a constant negotiation with death. My days are measured in tasks, and my nights are the quiet moments when memories press in and hope struggles against despair. I wake before dawn, though there is no dawn, and check the generator. It is old, temperamental, but it hums enough to keep the radio alive. I scan the frequencies for other survivors, for scraps of information, for any hint that someone else has endured. Each broadcast is a tether thrown into the void, a signal that someone, somewhere, is still human. Water is my obsession. Without it, nothing else matters. I ration carefully, storing it in rusted barrels and salvaged bottles. I hunt for streams, springs, or even puddles that might be safe to drink after filtration. Food is scavenged, stolen, or improvised, canned, goods decades past their prime, small animals caught with traps, edible roots dug from the dust-choked soil. Every meal is a victory, every sip of clean water a fleeting miracle. Fire is precious, not just for warmth, but for cooking, for signaling, for the fragile comfort it brings in the eternal grey. Movement is dangerous. Streets are littered with obstacles and threats. Rogue survivors, desperate and cruel, roam in packs. I have learned to avoid them, to read the signs, the subtle echoes of footsteps, the arrangement of debris, the smell of a campfire that is not mine. Sometimes, though, confrontation is unavoidable. I have had to defend myself, not out of malice, but necessity. Each encounter leaves a mark, both on the body and on the soul, a reminder that survival demands sacrifice. Yet, amid the ruin, I cling to purpose. Why do I persist when everything familiar is gone? Because hope, though fragile, is stronger than the void. Because someone, somewhere, might hear me and feel less alone. Because humanity is not entirely dead, not as long as there are those of us who refuse to surrender. I broadcast not just to survive, but to witness, to record what remains, what is lost, what still struggles to breathe. Each word I speak is a small defiance against silence, a testament that life endures even in the shadow of an endless eclipse. Loss is a constant companion. I remember my family vividly, faces frozen in time, voices echoing in my mind. I mourn friends who tried to escape with me and perished in the dust storms or the fires. The weight of their absence presses down in quiet moments, heavy enough to make the ribs ache. Yet I carry it like armor. It reminds me why survival matters, why persistence is necessary. Every day I live, I honor them, even if only by continuing to breathe. The world has forced me to adapt. I have learned to read the weather without sunlight, to track the signs of rain, wind, and temperature changes by subtle cues in the environment. I have mastered rationing, scavenging, and improvisation, turning scraps into tools, cans into stoves, wires into makeshift antennas. I understand how to move silently, how to hide from danger, how to survive on minimal resources. Every skill is hard-earned, every small success a shield against the darkness that surrounds me. But I am not immune to despair. Some nights, when the generator dies and the radio falls silent, the grey seems absolute. Memories rush in. The laughter of my sister, the smell of rain on the streets of my childhood, the warmth of a hand in mine. Loneliness presses like a physical weight. Sometimes I speak aloud, even if no one is listening, just to break the silence, to remind myself that I am still human, still capable of connection. The few companions I encounter are fleeting. A scavenger sharing a scrap of bread, a wanderer seeking water, a child too young to understand the collapse but clinging to life nonetheless. These brief intersections of lives are precious, teaching me that trust, though rare, is still possible, that humanity can persist in small gestures, in shared survival, in the quiet acknowledgement that none of us are truly alone if we remain vigilant, if we reach out, if we broadcast into the void. And so I continue, day after day, step after careful step. I walk through dust-choked streets, over cracked riverbeds, past the hollow shells of buildings, always listening, always scanning, always moving forward. I broadcast stories, warnings, guidance, and fragments of hope. I write what I see, what I hear, what I feel. I am the witness, the voice, the survivor. In this endless eclipse, where the sun never returns and the world struggles under the weight of its own collapse, I remain, not because it is easy, not because I am strong, but because there is no alternative. Survival is not heroic. It is relentless. It is learning to breathe when the air is poisoned, to find water when rivers vanish, to find meaning when all else is lost. And still, somehow, I persist. I am a survivor, a voice in the darkness, a flicker of light in a world that has forgotten what light feels like. I do not know how long I will endure, but I will keep moving, keep broadcasting, keep remembering. The eclipse has taken much, but it has not taken my will to survive. And as long as I draw breath, I will carry on. The crisis began quietly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was subtle shifts. The rivers running slower, the soil cracking under feet that once walked on fertile ground, the air growing heavier with dust and chemical residue. But quiet became relentless, and relentless became catastrophic. The endless eclipse had turned from curiosity to curse, and the world began to collapse in ways that could no longer be ignored. Water disappeared first, springs dried, reservoirs evaporated, and rivers shriveled into cracked channels. The Missouri River, once a lifeblood for thousands of towns along its banks, had become a hollow ribbon of mud, lined with the skeletons of boats and the remnants of docks that had rotted under the relentless sunless skies. We had watched it dwindle, powerless to stop the slide of our civilization into scarcity. Without water, crops failed. Livestock perished. Entire communities disappeared quietly, leaving behind only the echoes of their struggle and the faint scent of desiccated soil. I remember the first time I understood that survival would become a daily gamble. I had been searching for a hidden creek that old maps promised, hoping for even a trickle of water. The path was lined with toppled trees, the remnants of storms that tore through the area without warning. Dust choked my throat, and the wind, carried the acrid smell of burned structures from distant fires. The creek was nothing more than a shallow depression in the earth, cracked and dry, with a few scattered puddles too contaminated to drink without careful filtration. That day, I realized that survival was no longer about hope. It was about calculation, timing, and endurance. Other survivors began to appear in fits and starts. Some were desperate, haggard souls wandering alone, clinging to scraps of human decency. Others were predators, hardened by necessity, armed and ready to take what they needed by force. Encounters were tense and dangerous. One day, I came upon a scavenger group near an abandoned gas station, rifles in hand, eyes wary and wild. They had water, but no intention of sharing it. I backed away slowly, aware that negotiation could mean death, and walked a longer route. Home, stomach empty, thirst gnawing at my insides. Storms became more frequent and violent. Without sunlight, temperature regulation became unpredictable. Nights plunged into freezing darkness, while days could climb to suffocating heat. Winds carried debris in unpredictable patterns, capable of crushing buildings or sweeping away anyone unfortunate enough to be caught exposed. The eclipse itself warped weather cycles. Without sunlight to drive evaporation and condensation, rainfall became erratic, sometimes violent, sometimes non-existent, leaving deserts where fertile fields had once grown. Every day, the challenge became more immediate. Fuel for generators dwindled, and with it, the ability to purify water, cook food, or maintain warmth. Batteries, scavenged from abandoned buildings or broken vehicles, lasted only a fraction of what was needed. Every resource was precious, every choice critical. I had to weigh survival against survival. Do I use the remaining fuel to pump water, or to broadcast vital messages to other survivors? Every decision carried consequences that could not be undone. The mechanics of the disaster were starkly clear, at least to those who paid attention. Without sunlight, the world's temperature gradients collapsed. Weather systems became unstable, creating extreme droughts and unprecedented storms. Soil chemistry changed. Minerals that had been stabilized by natural cycles leached away under acidic rains. Flora and fauna adapted violently or perished, leaving human survivors to face an ecosystem that was now actively hostile. I tried to explain this on my broadcasts, not to scare, but to prepare anyone listening. The climate has changed. I would say, voice steady despite the panic behind it. Rainfall is no longer seasonal. Water is scarce. Heat and cold fluctuate unpredictably. You must ration, move carefully, and always have a backup for backup. Food scarcity compounded the crisis. Fields that had once yielded wheat, corn, and vegetables produced nothing. Greenhouses that survived initial storms now lay in ruins, glass shattered, plants rotting in soil poisoned by chemical runoff. Foraging became a careful science, identifying edible roots, trapping small animals, scavenging the remnants of canned goods, knowing which berries could kill instead of nourish. Every meal was a decision with consequences. Starvation was always one wrong step away. The collapse of society intensified the danger. With governments gone, law was obsolete. Survivor groups formed alliances, sometimes friendly, sometimes violent. Raiders preyed on the weak, moving in packs with strategy and brutality. I had learned to identify signs of approaching groups, the glint of metal, smoke rising in unnatural patterns, footprints too fresh to ignore. Negotiation often failed. Sometimes, avoidance was the only option. And yet, the rare alliance, someone willing to share water or information, was invaluable, reminding me that humanity had not completely vanished. I had begun documenting patterns, using simple science to predict danger. Dust storms, for instance, could be anticipated by changes in wind pressure and humidity. Floods could be traced by monitoring distant rainfall patterns via scavenged weather instruments. Even food sources could be analyzed, knowing the lifespan of canned goods, the growing cycles of resilient plants, and the migratory patterns of animals gave me an edge. a slim margin between life and death. Knowledge became a weapon as essential as any blade or firearm. Yet, each day was a test of endurance. My own body was under constant strain. The harsh environment caused sores, infections, and exhaustion. Sleep was precarious, measured in short bursts to avoid exposure or attack. Hunger and dehydration left the mind foggy, decision-making impaired. Every step carried risk. Every breath risked contamination. Every turn could reveal danger. And, still, I moved, because the alternative, standing still, meant death. The psychological toll was immense. Isolation pressed in like a physical force. Memories of lost friends and family, of a world that had warmth and laughter, clashed with the reality of ash, dust, and shadow. Sometimes, the mind betrayed me. Hallucinations, fleeting sounds of voices, imagined fires where none burned. Yet, the mind also offered survival. It kept me alert, reminded me of danger, pushed me to continue when instinct alone would falter. Survival was now a calculus of calculation, observation, and instinct. I had learned to track storms by the smell of the air and the angle of clouds, to identify edible plants by subtle signs of their growth cycles, to ration every calorie, every drop of water, every spark of electricity. Science became intuition, and intuition became survival. Every day was a balance between aggression and caution, hope and despair. The crisis was not abstract. It was immediate. Rivers were empty, cities were ruins, storms were relentless. Allies and enemies were impossible to distinguish without experience. Resources were minimal, and even those required constant effort to maintain. Knowledge was survival, and every moment spent unprepared could be the last. And yet, amid the tension, a stubborn pulse persisted. I broadcast these lessons, these observations, these warnings, hoping someone, somewhere, might survive because of them. The endless eclipse had taken much from the world, but it had not yet taken our ability to learn, adapt, and endure. That knowledge, that stubborn will, became the only weapon against a collapsing planet. Every day survived was a small defiance, a quiet rebellion against entropy, against chaos, against despair. The Missouri River, the forests, the cities, the fields, they were all reminders of what we had lost, but also what could still be preserved in fragments. Survival was not heroic. It was deliberate, meticulous, and exhausting. It demanded observation, foresight, and the willingness to face the horror without flinching. I had no illusions. The crisis would only worsen. Yet I continued. I had to, because even in the shadow of endless eclipse, survival was possible, and sometimes that was enough. The days were growing longer in their emptiness, but my tasks multiplied, as if the world itself were conspiring against me. The generator sputtered more frequently, its hum a fragile lifeline that could fail at any second. Water, always water, had become my obsession and my torment. The last barrels in the storage cache had dwindled to a fraction of what I needed to survive even a week. Every morning I rationed with precision, counting drops like precious coins, wondering if my calculations would carry me to the next dawn. Food was no less a problem. Cans that once held nourishment were dented, rusted, or expired. And even the small animals I trapped were becoming scarce. The landscape itself was shifting, subtle at first but undeniable. Burrows had gone silent. Tracks that once promised a catch were empty. Every step beyond the safety of my current shelter carried risk, physical, environmental, and human. Humans had become the new predators. I had learned to read the patterns of raider groups, those desperate, hardened survivors who scavenged with violence. One evening, as the sunless dusk thickened into endless grey, I spotted a group moving along a crumbling highway. Their armor was a patchwork of scavenged metal, helmets dented from some previous encounter, rifles slung low, eyes scanning. They were methodical, dangerous, and utterly indifferent to life outside their own survival. I watched them for hours, from the edge of a ruined overpass, heart hammering, calculating the likelihood of crossing their path. It was not a question of bravery, but of pure, cold necessity. To survive, I must evade them completely. Yet amid the tension, rumors began to circulate, a whisper of something almost mythical. Survivors had spoken of a valley, hidden and untouched, where water still flowed, and the land had not surrendered to dust. Some called it the Green Hollow, a place rumored to hold remnants of functioning farms and fresh wells. At first I dismissed it as wishful thinking, the desperate imaginings of people clinging to stories because hope itself had become scarce. But the whispers persisted, and fragments of maps, smudged and incomplete, began to surface. Every detail was second-hand, vague and unverified, but my instincts, the same instincts that had kept me alive this long, pushed me to consider it. The thought of Green Hollow both terrified and exhilarated me. To pursue it meant leaving the relative safety of my hideout, venturing across a landscape that had grown actively hostile. Dust storms could strike without warning. Rivers might have dried or flooded unpredictably, and every abandoned town along the way was a potential trap for raiders or looters. But the idea of fresh water, fertile soil, and perhaps other survivors was a flame I could not extinguish. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance at something beyond mere endurance. I had to prepare. Every ration, every drop of fuel, every bit of energy had to be accounted for. I scavenged abandoned buildings, careful to avoid the pitfalls that had ensnared so many others. Broken stores yielded scraps, cans of food, tools, sometimes batteries. I collected what I could carry, balancing necessity with the weight I could realistically transport. My calculations were precise. Water was my highest priority, fuel second, food third. Every decision was a gamble against the certainty of scarcity. Encounters with other survivors continued to be complicated. Some were fleeting allies. One man I met near a collapsed bridge offered a small ration of clean water and a warning of a raider patrol approaching from the east. We shared a short, tense conversation, speaking only what was necessary before going our separate ways. Others were more dangerous. A small band attempted to rob me while I was collecting supplies in the ruins of a grocery store. Shots rang out. I barely escaped, bruised and bleeding, with only half my scavenged supplies intact. The world had become a constant negotiation between caution, aggression, and trust that was never fully warranted. The environmental hazards themselves were worsening. Dust storms had grown larger, more aggressive, and longer lasting. One morning, I woke to the roar of wind tearing across the ruined cityscape, carrying a dense cloud of abrasive particles that stung the eyes and scraped the skin. Visibility was nil. I could only navigate by memory, clinging to walls and broken structures for orientation. Each storm left me exhausted, lungs raw from inhaling the acrid air, hands blistered from constant vigilance. These were not occasional threats. They were the new normal, unpredictable and lethal. Fuel shortages added another layer of tension. The generator was essential for water purification, light, and communication. Yet every day it required more maintenance than I could spare. I scavenged for gasoline, kerosene, and batteries in places I would never have dared before. Abandoned service stations, the wreckage of cars along highways, even partially flooded basements. Every discovery felt like a triumph. Every failure, a lesson carved painfully into muscle and memory. Without fuel, the radio fell silent, the water supply risked contamination, and the nights grew colder and darker. Amid all this, the mystery of Green Hollow became an obsession. I plotted routes carefully, noting areas most likely to harbor raiders, regions prone to dust storms, and the locations of potential water sources along the way. I studied the faint maps I had pieced together, marking landmarks, collapsed bridges, scorched fields, crumbling towns, as guides through the wasteland. Each day, I broadcast warnings and advice, sharing survival tactics and safety measures in case someone else was listening. It was a small defiance, a reminder that humanity could still cooperate, even if remotely. Trust, however, became the heaviest burden. I debated endlessly whether to confide in other survivors who appeared along the path. One woman, thin, with eyes sharp and wary, joined me briefly while we scavenged an abandoned warehouse. She claimed to know of Green Hollow, but her motives were unclear. Could I risk sharing my supplies and knowledge with her? The world had taught me that every act of trust was a gamble with potentially lethal consequences. I kept my own counsel, offering only what was necessary, withholding the most critical information until I could assess her reliability. Even as I moved forward, the psychological pressure mounted. Each dust storm, each encounter, each scarcity of water or food gnawed at the edges of my resolve. I replayed past failures in my mind, the people I could not save, the meals I could not secure, the nights I had almost succumbed to despair. Yet these reflections, as heavy as they were, reinforced the reason to continue. Survival demanded both, awareness and adaptation, and the pursuit of Green Hollow became both a practical strategy and a lifeline for my sanity. Science guided me through the chaos. I tracked barometric pressure, wind patterns, and soil moisture to predict storms and locate potential water. I tested soil and water samples for contamination, learning to differentiate safe sources from toxic ones. These practices were no longer academic. They were matters of life and death. Every observation informed every step I took, reducing the margin for error, even in a world that offered little mercy. The tension was constant, unrelenting. Nights offered no relief, the darkness pressing in alongside the unending grey of the eclipse. The wind carried the scent of smoke and rot, a reminder of how fragile any semblance of safety remained. And yet, every discovery, every scrap of food, every successful evasion of raiders was a small victory, a confirmation that persistence could still yield results. By the time I reached the outskirts of the northern plains, the first real signs of Green Hollow appeared, not the lush paradise of legend, but a hint of the life that might have endured. A patch of green amid the brown wasteland, a trickle of clear water, the faint sound of movement suggesting human activity. My pulse quickened, hope surged, tempered by caution. The world had taught me well that appearances could deceive, that every oasis could conceal danger. Still, the possibility of community, of real water, of fertile ground, drove me forward, even as exhaustion, hunger, and the spectre of raiders weighed on my mind. I paused on a ridge overlooking the valley, scanning for threats and resources. There was water, clear, moving, and untainted by visible debris. There were structures, partially intact, suggesting some degree of human adaptation and protection. And there, in the distance, figures moved cautiously, perhaps scouting, perhaps guarding. I did not know if these were allies or another band of raiders. Trust would have to be earned, and I would have to decide whether to risk revealing my presence. And yet, even in that moment, I felt it, the fragile pulse of hope, stubborn and defiant, pressing against the grey, the dust, and the despair. Survival had led me here, and now the choice was not merely to endure, but to act, to decide if this spark could be nurtured, or if it would be snuffed out by the harsh realities of this new world. In the rising tension of scarcity, danger, and uncertainty, the path ahead became clear. I would move forward, carefully, deliberately, guided by both instinct and reason. The world was unforgiving, but persistence remained a weapon. Every step, every observation, every calculation brought me closer to understanding whether survival was possible on more than a daily basis, whether life could be rebuilt, even in the shadow of the endless eclipse. The ridge overlooked Green Hollow like a fragile promise suspended between dust and shadow. For the first time in years, I could see water moving freely, clear, untainted, a glimmering artery in the desolation. Trees had grown stubbornly amid the cracked earth, their leaves muted but alive. Structures, partially intact, suggested that someone, or some group, had not only survived but adapted. For a heartbeat, the weight of possibility pressed down, and I felt something that had been absent for far too long. Hope, but the hope was immediate, precarious, and dangerous. Figures moved through the valley below, cautious and alert. Raiders, survivors, I could not tell. My pulse quickened, each step backward or forward measured, calculated. Years of instinct guided me, but instinct had its limits. I needed a plan, a way to approach without revealing too much, to observe without becoming prey. I had barely begun to descend the ridge when the wind shifted, carrying with it a familiar warning. Dust, not just dust, a storm, massive and sudden, blackening the horizon like a wall of ash. I froze. Years of surviving these storms had taught me their power. They could bury a human alive, collapse weakened structures, and render water unfit, to drink in minutes. And now, with the storm moving faster than I expected, I realized that hesitation was no longer an option. I crouched behind a rock, scanning the valley. The water below shimmered deceptively, promising life even as the sky darkened. And then movement caught my eye. A group of humans, not raiders, not predators, but something in between. Cautious, armed, but clearly organized. They spotted me too, hesitation flickering across their faces. Trust, I knew, could not be assumed. Every moment of hesitation might cost both of us dearly. The storm struck first. A wall of wind and dust roared upward, slamming against the ridge, lifting debris like missiles, stinging my exposed skin. Visibility dropped to nothing. I could barely see the ground beneath my feet, let alone the valley or the figures below. Instinct took over. I clutched my pack, tucked myself behind the largest boulder, and prayed the structure would hold against the sheer force of nature. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The storm's roar was deafening, a relentless drum that buried every other sound. I could hear water surging from the creek, now swollen with sudden runoff, carrying sediment and debris downstream. Trees groaned, some snapping under the pressure, their shattered limbs slicing the air like jagged knives. Every decision became a question of life or death, move and risk being swept away, or stay and risk being buried by the relentless force. Through the chaos, I caught glimpses of the humans below. They were struggling too, navigating the storm with makeshift tarps and ropes, signaling to each other with urgent gestures. I realized they were not raiders. They were survivors, like me. Their presence was a potential lifeline, but reaching them now meant risking the storm's wrath. I weighed my options. To wait meant safety, but delayed connection. To move meant potential death, but access to knowledge, resources, and possibly community. My instincts screamed that the storm would not wait. I began my descent, low and cautious, every step calculated against the loose soil and jagged debris. The wind tore at my clothes, whipped sand into my eyes, and howled through the ruined landscape like a predator. But the thought of water, of other survivors, of the possibility that life could exist beyond mere survival, propelled me forward. My body screamed in protest, muscles burning, lungs raw, but I pressed on. A sudden collapse of a weakened ridge forced me to jump, landing awkwardly on one knee. Pain shot through me, but I forced myself to continue. The storm was relentless, but so was my will. Each breath was shallow, each movement painstaking, but the valley, and what it might hold, loomed closer. I reached a narrow ledge overlooking the creek where the survivors were now taking shelter. Their eyes met mine, wide with fear, suspicion, and recognition of shared struggle. I raised a hand, signaling peace, and they hesitated, unsure. The storm raged, a constant threat pressing us both to make impossible choices. I had to decide: retreat to my hiding spot, maintaining isolation but missing the chance at connection, or risk everything to reach them. I moved forward. The first step onto the creek bank nearly lost me to a surge of muddy water, but I grabbed a tree branch and steadied myself. Others mirrored my efforts cautiously, moving closer despite the storm. Communication was almost impossible. Gestures replaced words as the wind tore through the valley. And then, a moment of clarity. If we did not work together, none of us would survive the storm. Survival demanded collaboration. The humans, a small band of 4, accepted my presence cautiously, offering a limited ration of water they had salvaged. In the chaos, trust was tentative but essential. We pooled knowledge. One had experience with water filtration. Another had maps indicating a secondary spring further upstream. Together, we assessed the storm's trajectory, calculated how long we could remain exposed, and prepared for the next wave of danger. Cooperation, I realized, was not just beneficial. It was survival. But the climax was not merely environmental. As the storm subsided slightly, a low, mechanical groan rose from the trees. A structure, weakened by both time and tempest, was collapsing toward the creek where we sheltered. Debris rained down, narrowly missing us. In that instant, I faced a choice: save myself by retreating to higher ground, or risk injury to secure the water cache and equipment that could sustain all of us. I acted instinctively, moving toward the cache. Rocks and timber fell around me, cutting and bruising, but I managed to secure the water containers and a small generator before the final collapse. The others assisted where they could, and together we staggered to a safer position, hearts pounding, clothes torn, lungs raw. The storm had passed, but the test had not ended. It was then, in the aftermath of immediate danger, that I reflected on everything that had brought me here. The endless eclipse, the scarcity, the raids, the dust storms, they were all crucibles, shaping not only my body but my resolve. I realized that survival was no longer about isolation, about avoiding the world. It was about calculated risk, about finding others who could endure alongside me, about using knowledge, skill, and courage to navigate a planet that had turned hostile. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe in possibility. Green Hollow, though battered and incomplete, represented more than water and shelter. It represented human resilience, ingenuity, and the stubborn refusal to surrender entirely to despair. Yet I knew the risk was far from over. Each day would bring new storms, new scarcity, and new human challenges. Trust would always be tentative, danger ever present. But I had reached a turning point. I had chosen action over fear, connection over isolation, hope over surrender. As night fell over the valley, though the eclipse ensured it was always twilight, I stood with the small band of survivors. The generator hummed weakly, filtered, water sloshed in containers, and the faint glow of lanterns illuminated faces that, like mine, had endured far too much to be easily broken. I realized that survival had transformed from a solitary struggle into a shared endeavor. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, the spark of potential, fragile and flickering, was enough to drive us forward. In that moment, I confronted the truth I had avoided for so long. Survival alone was hollow. Life, even in a shattered world, required engagement, cooperation, and the courage to take risks. The endless eclipse had tested me to the edge of despair, but it had also shown that the choices I made, the risks I took, could shape outcomes far beyond my own existence. I was no longer just a witness in the static. I was an active participant in the fragile reconstruction of life. And so, with the storm behind us and the valley ahead, I made the choice to move forward, to guide, to survive, and to trust, cautiously, in the possibility that humanity could endure even here, in the shadow of desolation. The turning point was not merely discovery or danger, it was the understanding that hope, even when tentative and precarious, required action, courage, and the willingness to confront both nature and humanity with all the tools at my disposal. The ridge had tested me, the storm had tested me, and the band of survivors had tested me. But as I looked down at the flowing water, the partial shelter, and the faint flicker of light through the battered trees, I understood that I had passed the test. Not unscathed, not unafraid, but alive, resolute, and ready to face the next challenge the world would throw at us. The turning point had arrived, not in victory, but in the conscious decision to engage fully with the uncertain, dangerous, and fragile world that remained. The storm had passed, leaving the valley in an uneasy calm. The air, though still thick with dust, carried a faint scent of damp soil, a reminder that water could still exist beyond scarcity, that life could cling even in the shadow of desolation. I crouched beside the creek, now swollen with runoff from higher terrain, and let the sound of moving water settle my frayed nerves. Each ripple was a pulse of possibility, fragile and fleeting, but undeniably real. The small band of survivors I had encountered during the storm had begun to move with cautious purpose. Together, we salvaged what remained of the partially collapsed structures. Broken beams were repurposed for makeshift shelters. Torn tarps, patched with scraps of fabric, became protection against wind and dust, and containers of water were carefully rationed. The generator, though battered, hummed steadily enough to purify the creek water, giving us a sense of control in a world that had otherwise surrendered to chaos. We worked in near silence, the kind of quiet born not of comfort, but of shared fatigue. Words were sparse, gestures deliberate. In this world, every motion carried significance. A misplaced step could ruin supplies. A loud voice could attract unwanted attention. Yet, in that quiet labor, there was also a subtle shift in perspective. Survival was no longer a solitary battle. It had become a collaborative act, fragile and tense, but infinitely more resilient than my previous isolation. I took a moment to reflect on my own journey. Years of wandering the wasteland, avoiding raiders, scavenging in ruins, had hardened me in ways both visible and invisible. My body bore the scars of dust storms, of falls, of minor conflicts. My mind carried the weight of loss, faces I could not forget, lives I could not save, and the constant tension of uncertainty. But now, standing amid these survivors, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel for a long time. A sense of purpose beyond mere endurance. Hope, I realized, was not a grand, unshakable certainty. It was fragile, tentative, often wrapped in fear and calculation. Yet it existed here, in the form of water, in the small human community, in the knowledge that we could adapt, repair, and persist. The creek, swollen and clear, symbolized more than sustenance. It was a tangible reminder that the world still offered opportunities if one was willing to act, to collaborate, and to endure. We began to explore the surrounding valley cautiously, noting areas that might serve as future gardens or shelter sites. A patch of soil, though dry on the surface, retained moisture underneath, suggesting that cultivation might be possible with careful effort. Trees, stubborn and twisted, bore leaves, and some sparse fruit, indicating that even the most resilient vegetation could survive extremes. These small observations were encouraging, reminders that while civilization had collapsed, nature had not entirely surrendered. Encounters with other survivors were tentative but ongoing. One day, a young man emerged from the eastern ridge, gaunt, with a scavenged pack slung over his shoulder. He claimed to have heard our radio broadcasts and had followed them, seeking guidance and refuge. Trust, again, became a careful negotiation. We shared water and food sparingly, observed him closely, and gradually allowed him to participate in our collective labor. Each new person represented both opportunity and risk, the chance for companionship and shared strength, balanced against the possibility of scarcity, betrayal, or conflict. Reflection became unavoidable. I thought of the countless choices that had brought me here, the decision to pursue Green Hollow, the calculated risk to join the group during the storm, the determination to act rather than retreat. Each choice had been weighted with uncertainty, yet collectively they had shaped not only my survival but the possibility of others' survival. I understood, in a way I had not before, that survival was not simply about enduring the elements. It was about making choices that carried meaning, that contributed to something larger than individual existence. Environmental observation continued, alongside survival. The valley, while battered, showed signs of gradual recovery. Streams and rivulets carried sediment and debris, but also life, small fish, insects, and resilient plants. Birds, cautious and silent at first, had begun to return, in limited numbers. The soil, though scorched in many places, retained pockets of fertility. Each sign was a reminder that the world, though fractured, was not beyond repair. Yet the risk of regression was constant. Another storm could wipe out the fragile gains. Another dust-laden wind could poison the creek. Another encounter with hostile humans could undo progress. I began documenting everything: water quality, soil condition, weather patterns, and human activity. Every observation was both practical and symbolic. In a world without institutions, science became a personal compass, guiding decisions and preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Notes were scrawled on scraps of paper, in journals, in whatever I could find. Maps, measurements, and reflections intertwined. Knowledge itself was survival, and recording it was an act of defiance against the entropy of the world. The survivors and I worked to establish routines: daily patrols of the valley's perimeter, careful management of water and food, repair and fortification of shelters, and the maintenance of the generator. Each task was a thread in a fragile tapestry of endurance. Slowly, we began to understand one another, learning strengths and weaknesses, assigning roles that maximized efficiency and minimized risk. The human element, cautious, fractured, and wary, proved as crucial as any environmental or material resource. Yet anxiety remained. The endless eclipse, though unchanged in its permanence, reminded us of the larger forces still in play. Dust. Storms could strike without warning. The soil could fail. Other human groups could threaten our fragile settlement. The need for vigilance was constant, the margin for error slim. But even amid this tension, there was a sense of rhythm, of structure, of survival evolving into stability, however fragile. I reflected on my personal evolution. The solitary survivalist I had once been had transformed into a cautious leader, a guide and an observer of both nature and humanity. My capacity for trust, though still measured and guarded, had grown. I recognized the value of shared knowledge, of communal effort, and of deliberate, calculated risk. Survival had shifted from a purely individual endeavor into a collaborative one. This understanding did not erase fear, grief, or fatigue, but it reframed them as part of a broader, ongoing process. Even as we settled into these routines, I remained acutely aware of the fragility of our position. The valley's resources were finite. The creek, though generous now, could dry or become contaminated. The human element remained unpredictable. Trust could be tested, alliances broken, and yet each challenge we faced became an opportunity to reaffirm resilience. Each day survived, each ration managed, each small harvest tended, was a testament to persistence against a world that had turned hostile. At night, when the generator hummed quietly and the survivors rested, I would stand at the edge of the valley, listening to the faint trickle of water and the occasional rustle of foliage. In those moments, reflection was unavoidable. I thought of the people I had lost, the cities that had crumbled, the dust-laden skies that had been my ceiling for years. But I also thought of the valley, of flowing water, of cautious companions, and of the delicate pulse of life that persisted despite overwhelming odds. The aftermath of the storm and the pursuit of Green Hollow had changed more than my circumstances. It had changed me. I no longer measured survival solely by the hours until the next meal or the next storm. I measured it by the capacity to make meaningful choices, to act with purpose, and to connect with others, however tenuously. Life, I realized, was not simply about existing. It was about navigating a fractured world with attention, care, and courage. Green Hollow itself, though damaged and imperfect, symbolized something far greater than the sum of its parts. Water flowed, plants clung stubbornly to life, and humans, though wary, cautious, and fragile, had begun to create a semblance of order. The valley was not paradise. It was not safe from storms, scarcity, or human conflict. But it was real. It was proof that endurance, adaptation, and careful action could carve out spaces of possibility in a world dominated by ruin. In the fading twilight, I allowed myself a small, deliberate act of gratitude. I filled a container with water, feeling the cool liquid against my hands, and drank slowly. It was not simply nourishment, it was affirmation. I was still alive. The others were still alive. And for the first time in years, I felt the faint, almost imperceptible rhythm of optimism. Fragile, tenuous, and unsteady, but undeniable. As I settled beside the survivors, watching the faint glow of lanterns illuminate faces etched with fatigue and determination, I understood the true lesson of the climax we had endured. Survival was not about solitary endurance. It was about observing, learning, acting, and above all, recognizing that hope, even a fragile spark, could sustain the human spirit in ways mere survival could not. And so, as the valley settled into a tentative peace and the eclipse continued, its unyielding presence above, I reflected on what had changed. I had found water, community, and purpose. I had confronted fear, scarcity, and human unpredictability. And I had realized that the world, while irrevocably altered, still offered spaces where life could persist, adapt, and even, cautiously, thrive. The aftermath was not a resolution. It was a continuation. The valley, the creek, and the survivors were proof that resilience could manifest, that careful action could carve out fragile oases in the midst of desolation. And though the future remained uncertain, and though storms, scarcity, and human danger would continue to shape our existence, we had passed through the crucible together. The spark of hope, though small, flickered with a quiet determination, enough to sustain us through whatever lay ahead. The valley had settled into a fragile rhythm. The creek flowed, stubborn and steady, and the survivors moved with cautious determination, repairing shelters, rationing water, and tending to what little vegetation remained. For a moment, the world seemed almost bearable, almost normal. But I knew better. The eclipse still hung overhead, a perpetual shadow reminding us that nothing in this world was permanent, that every day of survival was a battle against forces beyond comprehension. I walked along the ridge, letting my eyes wander across the scarred landscape. Once, this land had been familiar, vibrant, full of life and routine. Now it was fractured, a patchwork of dust, cracked soil, and skeletal remnants of civilization. Yet, among the ruins, there were pockets of stubborn vitality, a tree clinging to a rocky outcrop, a small bird flitting over the creek, a survivor sharing their last portion of water. These glimpses were fleeting, but they were real, and they mattered. Hope, I realized, was not a grand declaration or a guarantee of safety. It was fragile, flickering in the small victories, the discovery of a reliable water source, the survival of another human soul, the warmth of shared labor and cautious trust. Every ration we salvaged, every repair we made to the shelters, every cautious step toward cooperation was a reaffirmation of life itself. The storm had passed, but survival was not about weathering a single tempest. It was about enduring the relentless succession of them, one after another, with no pause, no certainty. I paused by the creek, cupping water in my hands, feeling the coolness against my skin. Each droplet was precious. Each one represented potential, continuity, and a small rebellion against a world determined to strip us of everything. I drank slowly, deliberately, savoring the act not just as hydration, but as affirmation. I was still here. We were still here. Against the odds, the collapse, the endless eclipse, life continued, messy, fragile, imperfect, but undeniably alive. The survivors gathered around the generator, which hummed quietly, a thin thread connecting us to something familiar, something human-made that still functioned in a broken world. Conversations were sparse, punctuated by gestures and brief exchanges. Trust remained measured, cautious. We had learned the hard way that human connections were as fragile as water in the desert, yet they were also essential. To survive alone was possible, but to endure with others, cautiously, deliberately, was a form of resilience deeper than mere endurance. I reflected on everything that had brought me here, the long years of wandering, the storms endured, the encounters with strangers who had been both allies and threats, the calculated risks I had taken during the climactic storm to secure water and shelter. Each choice had been weighted with fear, uncertainty, and potential cost. Yet collectively, they had shaped not only my survival, but the possibility of life for others. I understood now that hope was not a certainty, but a choice, a decision to act, to persist, and to recognize potential even amid devastation. Night descended, though the eclipse ensured it was a perpetual twilight. Lanterns glowed faintly, illuminating the tired but determined faces of the survivors. The hum of the generator was a constant reminder that our existence depended on careful attention and deliberate effort. Tomorrow, we would rise and tend the valley, monitor the water, repair what needed repairing, and plan for the next challenge. The world was still hostile. Scarcity, storms, and human conflict remained ever-present threats. Yet within the rhythm of survival, there was purpose. There was meaning in action, no matter how small the victories. I thought of the horizon beyond the valley, of the unknown landscapes we might explore, of the human networks we might encounter or clash with. Each possibility was both promise and peril. I had learned that fear could be a guide as much as it could be a paralyzer. Respecting danger, weighing risk, and acting with intention were not signs of weakness. They were instruments of survival. And so, even as uncertainty stretched into the indefinite future, I felt the faint steadiness of resolve. The eclipse had cast the world into permanent shadow, yet in this darkness I saw light, not radiant, not unshakable, but enough to sustain motion, thought, and purpose. Enough to remind me that life, however tenuous, was worth defending, worth nurturing, worth struggling for. The aftermath of the storm, the discovery of water, the cautious formation of community, all of these were small victories, fragile and fleeting, yet they were victories nonetheless. I knelt by the creek one last time, feeling the water slip through my fingers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new scarcity, new storms, and perhaps new losses. But tonight, I allowed myself the acknowledgement of survival and progress. We were still breathing. We were still acting. We were still choosing life. That, in a world that had forgotten both, was extraordinary. And so I speak to anyone listening, anyone who might still hear the hum of the radio, the crackle of static, or the echo of another human voice across the wasteland. Do not surrender entirely. Hope is fragile, yes, but it is not absent. It resides in the smallest actions, in the deliberate choice to continue, to connect, to survive. One day, one step, one decision at a time. It matters. You matter. I do not know what tomorrow holds. The eclipse will continue. Storms will come. Scarcity will persist. And danger will remain. But for now, for this moment, we have enough to endure. Enough to act, to care, to maintain the thread of life that remains. And as long as we breathe, as long as we move deliberately through the chaos, we keep that spark alive. The world may be broken, the sun may be hidden, civilization may have crumbled, but in the quiet determination of the living, in the shared labor of survivors, in the careful tending of water, shelter, and trust, there exists a fragile truth. Life persists. Hope endures, even in shadow. And for today, that is enough. Stay alive. Stay human. The eclipse may never end, the storms may never cease, but as long as we act, as long as we endure, the world still offers the faintest chance of continuity, of recovery, of survival. That is the message I leave, not with certainty, but with steadfast intention. Keep moving, keep choosing, keep believing. Even when hope is just a flicker in the darkness, it is enough